Philando Castile, Samuel Dubose, Freddie Gray, Akai Gurley, Tamir Rice, Walter L. Scott, Sandra Bland, Mario Woods,
George Floyd, and how many names of people that we don't have, not only in the past, how many will we lose in the future? We all worry about that. This program, The Sounds of Struggle, really looks at music as a touch point, a place to meet people, a place of coming together. And in many ways, it's about the American cultural fabric and the kind of seminal space that Black music, jazz, has had in our history, and how that has then influenced and been a part of a kind of allyship of understanding what movements mean, not only in this time that we're living in now, but going back far, far in the past, going back 40 years, and really thinking about what that impact can say for how we go forward. Asia Society has worked with Jon Jang and Francis Wong over many years, and many other artists, in really envisioning a kind of American fabric in which movements were really at the crux, and really jazz has been a big part of that. And what do we call jazz? But the kind of inspiration for understanding our society in a more nuanced, deeper way, and one that is really, in fact, questions the idea of how can we be inclusive? What does inclusive mean? How can that become something that is actually meaningful to the ways we live our lives? So I'm very much thinking about this 1 year anniversary and what it calls us to action. But I'm also thinking about the work of the artists that we're featuring today, and a thought experience of what that means. And I'm very delighted to have Cat Zhang, who is here, who is a young journalist and thinker and provocateur who's really been helping us navigate. But I think she's also brought a kind of curiosity to a body of work and a sense of movement that I hope that we will have a chance to better explore today. So please, let me just say one more thing. At the end of our program, we will have time for question and answer. Please do put that into the chat so that we can get some thoughts that you may well want to hear from our speakers today. So with that, take it away, Cat.
Hi, thank you so much, Rachel. It's a real honor to be here. As someone in the youngest generation, I am still coming into my consciousness as an Asian American, which is why this feels so meaningful to me, because when I was growing up, I never really understood that there was sort of an Asian American history of activism, that you could kind of be political and be yourself. And then also last summer, as the Black Lives Matter protest was happening, I kept on thinking about, what was the relationship between what was happening in the streets and the marches that I was participating in, and then also my daytime job as a music critic. And somehow these worlds felt like they should be interrelated, but they felt a little sealed from each other. And so I was constantly trying to interrogate, what is the relationship between politics and music, and what is my role in this as an Asian American music listener and critic? And so I've really appreciated being able to have conversations with people like Jon and Francis, who have been involved in decades of Asian American activism and have come to understand themselves as a part of a political struggle, but also a political struggle that's aligned with the political struggle of other people, and have managed to channel it in music in a way that is not just, pandering or didactic, which can be sometimes difficult with music that is branded as political. So I guess to start off, to introduce this, as a young person, I was really surprised to learn about the sort of Asian American movement, the early Asian American movement, and all of the political stuff that was going on at the time. And you two were both sort of coming of age. So I was wondering, what your early political education was like. And maybe we could start with Francis, because I know your brother was, I think, at UC Berkeley at the time of the Third World Strikes.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you so much, Kat. Hold on. I might as well thank Jon, because, we've been together. This is like our 40th anniversary, right, Jon, of knowing each other and actually meeting each other in a Asian American movement space back in 1980, 81, something like that. And but yeah, I first came into contact with the political movement because when I was in sixth grade, my brother was at UC Berkeley in the fall of 1969. He was starting college, and he was walking through Sproul Plaza, which is like the main place where all the student movement kind of gathered. And that was the day he remembers the helicopters went over and says, you all disperse from the crowd, and we're going to come back in 10 minutes and drop tear gas on you guys. And so, but 5 minutes later, the helicopters came back and they tear gassed everybody in the plaza. And so that was kind of his introduction to the politics. So was not a really heady thing. It was, really part of, there was this movement going on to resist the draft, to support ethnic studies, and he was introduced very viscerally through the repression of the state. And so that kind of brought up his interest in ethnic studies, and he used to bring his ethnic studies books home to me, and then that's how I got introduced to the politics of Malcolm X and the politics of the Asian American movement. Yeah, at a young age, I think I was 12. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then, Jon, you had talked about how you sort of visited bookstores in Palo Alto and were incredibly influenced by Black liberation movement music and books. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So during the late 60s and early 1970s, Black revolutionary politics and Black liberation music became a popular social phenomenon. And Francis, he was a middle school student in South San Francisco, and I was in high school in Palo Alto, which was a quiet, predominantly white middle-class suburb about 35 miles south of San Francisco. Maybe we could see the slide. No, I'm sorry. I take that back. I'm improvising here. So in Palo Alto, there was a bookstore called the Camara Bookstore, which carried books and recordings about Black revolutionary politics and Black liberation music. So in Malcolm X's book, By Any Means Necessary, Malcolm X recognized the importance of Black music to Black liberation. And so at the first public rally of the Organization of Afro-American Unity in New York in 1964, Malcolm X explained that Black music is the only area in America where Black people has been free to create and has mastered it. So if Black people are given intellectual independence, Black people can create a society that hasn't been invented, just like the Black musician who improvises on something that he hasn't heard yet.
And can you elaborate, or I guess some people might say, Asian Americans and jazz, or, these are two different kind of ideas, Asian struggle and Black struggle. So I was wondering specifically what kinds of principles and maybe ideas you feel like you got from both the kind of music and then the speeches and the literature.
Well, I feel that music is a language, or it's made up of many languages. So if there's ever been sort of the skepticism that Asian Americans cannot perform Black music because we're not Black, then I guess the same can be said that we cannot perform 18th and 19th century Western European classical music because we're not Europeans. So it's a language. If you're white, Black, Chinese American, you can learn Chinese language. You can learn French language. You can learn Spanish. So that's my perspective. But also, I think it's important for Asian Americans to collaborate and respect Black music and the creators of that music. And so I think with Francis and me, if we're leading ensembles with Black musicians, it's kind of awkward. And so we're very mindful that the Black musicians are equal, if not more, and that they're not the hired help. That's the kind of relationship we do not want.
Both of you are associated with what is deemed the Asian American jazz movement, although I know that phrase is a little iffy among some people who are technically a part of it. I was wondering how this kind of idea of an Asian American jazz came to be in the first place, and what was your kind of early engagement with the concept?
Well, I'll go first.
Yeah.
So, actually, we came into contact with the term Asian American jazz through the Asian American Jazz Festival, which was started by Kearney Street Workshop. That was founded by I guess George Leong and Paul Yamazaki. And so it was a banner, I think, and really a very important space that was created for Asian Americans to feel like they could be themselves in the music. And so and within that space, it was really important that the Asian American jazz space wasn't just Asian Americans, but really it was really a continuation of the third world solidarity movements. Just like everybody who, just like, so that at that first Asian American Jazz Festival that John and I attended, there was this band United Front with Anthony Brown and Mark Izu and George Sams and Louis Jordan, There was the band with Russell Baba and Eddie Moore. I mean, all the bands kind of had this kind of solidarity, and I think to me that was the idea that jazz could be a space or field in which this kind of solidarity could be expressed and built. That really inspired, both John and me to kind of go further into that,
And there was a strong Black-Asian solidarity. So, like in the San Francisco Bay Area, you had United Front, which was made up of 3 African-American musicians and 2 Asian-American musicians. In New York, you had Jason Kao Wong, who was part of a group called Commitment with William Parker, and that was a Black-Asian ensemble. And then also in the San Francisco Bay Area at that Asian American Jazz Festival, the first one in October of 1981, there was Russell Baba's ensemble that Francis mentioned with Eddie Moore and a white musician named Mel Graves.
One thing that seemed very distinctive to me about Asian American jazz, or that was surprising to me, was that, it wasn't necessarily just Asian Americans playing jazz music, but that you were actively trying to kind of incorporate elements of your own heritage or of traditional Asian musics, but in a way that wasn't, awkwardly crammed together or, fetishistic in any way. And so I was wondering how you kind of thought about blending those elements in with progressive jazz, and maybe what concepts in each of them you felt like aligned together.
Well, one of the reasons why we reject jazz is because we don't perform in clubs. We do not perform jazz standards. We perform our music. We create and we own the music, and that's in the spirit of some of these these Black music collectives, such as the Association for the Advancement of Creative Music in Chicago, BAG, which is Black Artists Group in St. Louis, UGMA, which is Horst Tapscott in Los Angeles, and in New York there was like actually your turn, Francis. Why don't you complete that? I don't want to be Mr. Know-It-All.
Well, see, I think like for me it was like there was a space that was created in San Francisco. There's something particular about San Francisco because Keystone Corner was right next to Chinatown, and so, but I actually saw a collaboration between Ali Akbar Khan and John Handy. And when they got together, they just played music together. They didn't, and wasn't trying to fit into each other, but just to try to make music together. So in real time, these great musicians really, masters, were trying to communicate and create communion. And so to me, that was kind of like an invitation to say that I could bring something to the table, from my heritage, and to because the example was already being set by the masters.
Yeah, and there were Black musicians that were experimenting with Asian traditional music, such as Billy Harper, was that recording in Paris. He took Sorambushi, which is a Japanese fisherman song of North Hokkaido, and he turned it into his own work. It was really great. McCoy Tyner, there's on the album cover of Sahara, he's sitting in the ghetto part of Philadelphia playing on a koto, a Japanese zither instrument. So those were early examples and inspirations of the use of Asian traditional instruments and music by Black musicians.
Well, I also wanted to mention Monk did a recording of Pedro City, which is the moon over the ruined castle, and these things provided a milestones to go by, and it was just inspiring a few years ago that Mia was returned to that composition and did a recording with Reggie Workman and Andrew Cyril. And so I think it's just like this discourse, between the musics and how these musics were signifiers on the part of Asian Americans and Black musicians.
Growing up, I had some kind of relationship to Chinese culture through my parents, but they didn't necessarily play Chinese music. A lot of the music I listened to was just through pop radio, and probably, a lot of people in China also love kind of Western popular music. So I think some young people might listen to this and say, well, I have no connection to Chinese folk songs or any of these traditions. And I was wondering whether you kind of grew up with that training or whether you actively sought out that kind of education.
Well, my story is in 1988, Francis Wong and I were members of the Chinese Progressive Association, which was a Chinese American progressive organization based in San Francisco, Chinatown. And so there was the Chinese Progressive Association, also known as CPA, invited me to perform at their 16th anniversary banquet. And so the director, Mabel Tang, had asked me to perform either the Butterfly Lover song or the Yellow River Cantata. And I asked her if she had any recordings or even music, and she said no. So I had to haphazardly walk down Grant Avenue, the main street of San Francisco Chinatown, scratching my head, asking merchants who only spoke Cantonese and I only spoke English, if they had recordings of the Butterfly Lover song. I would do that this is 1988, which was like 4 years after Morris Day and Time does this performance called The Bird. It was like in the Prince Purple Rain film. But anyway, I started flapping my wings, and so my bird flapping technique was too good. They showed me a cassette recording of birds flapping. So fortunately, to make a long story short, a CPA member did have the vinyl recording, and I learned it overnight. And because Jesse Jackson paid a lot of visits to San Francisco Chinatown, talking not about the Rainbow Coalition or this election, but also talking about Asian American issues. Sometimes Francis and I would have to play his anthem, which was "Country Preacher" by Cannonball Adderley, but it was composed by Joseph Zawinul. And that was recorded at, Operation Breadbasket event in Chicago in 1969, which is organized by the Southern Christian leadership. I'm losing my memory on that. But and so there was a merger of, this is sort of like Black Asian solidarity through the music, through the blend of the Black church soul groove of Country Preacher with this beautiful traditional melody that originated from the first all-women's Chinese opera company. So that was a starting point for me to explore, actually more specifically, Chinese traditional music.
I think one of the things I just want to point out is that while we may not have grown up with this music, we want it to be relatable as musicians in the communities that we were committed to being involved with as organizers. And so my first recording called Great Wall is actually a Chinese patriotic song that was given to me and John by a librarian, a Chinese or Taiwanese librarian who was fighting Stanford University because she had been a union organizer and she had been fired. And so part of the being relatable in terms of building the movement was to really to engage with the culture. And she was she taught Chinese language school, and they used songs to teach teach Mandarin in that kind of that Palo Alto area. And so she said, "Hey, you guys are creative. Here's some songs that we teach, and why don't you do something with them?" And so I think, to me, I just think that that was connected to what John just talked about, is that as we became engaged in the Chinatown community or in Chinese communities of the peninsula, we were part of relating to the community was to figure out how we can bring through music, music, a way to relate and build a bridge and build community with music that people and so, and then also to show as in terms of our experiences in our music, to kind of show a kind of a maybe start creating the future together, because I always thought that what we were doing and what we continue to do today in our organizing is that we're trying to create a new future, and how this music can really be part of helping us think about creativity and think about how we are going to create that new world together.
Great. I wanted to ask a question about kind of anti-Asian violence, and this is a big issue that people is an awakening for some people. But first, I wanted to ask if we could go to the East Wind slide and maybe take a look at that and listen to some of the sounds.
East Wind! Equality for Asian people! East Wind! Justice for Vincent Chin! East Wind! Equality for Asian people! East Wind! Justice for Vincent Chin! East Wind! Equality for Asian people! East Wind! Justice for Vincent Chin! East Wind! Equality for Asian people! East Wind! Justice for Vincent Chin! East Wind! Equality for Asian people! East Wind!
I think something that's that Asian American people who are maybe, just becoming political and becoming kind of aware of the broader structures of America, they are kind of surprised maybe to know that anti-Asian violence isn't new, and it never has been new. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about what we saw on the slide there, and what things were happening in the 80s that Asian American activists were kind of focused on at the time.
Yeah, well, there was a rise of anti-Asian violence, and part of it was when Japan became a stronger force in building cars, like Toyota and Honda. And so there's the story about Vincent Chin, who was a 27-year-old Chinese American draftsman who was about to get married. This was like June 18th, 1982. It was around Father's Day, and he was at this strip club with his friends. It was a bachelor's party called the Fancy Pants in a suburb near Detroit, Michigan. And so these two white men said to Vincent Chin, "It's because of you MFs, you mother Fs, that we're out of work." And the one white man, his name was Ronald Evans, he was actually a foreman for an auto plant. And then his stepson, Michael Nitz, he was a laid off auto worker, but he wasn't hurting. I think he worked at a bar. So anyway, they got kicked out, and the two white men stalked Vincent Chin and his friends to like a Jack in the Box. And Evans had a baseball bat, and he bashed Vincent Chin's head. He hit it 4 times, and Vincent Chin died a couple days later. And then there was about a year later, I think it was March 1983, Judge Kaufman exonerated the two white men. Okay, so before I should say that, the two white men made Vincent Chin a scapegoat for the anti-import Japanese hysteria that was going on. So yeah, going back to March 1983, Judge Kaufman said, you should let the crime fit the criminal, not crime fit the punishment. And he exonerated these two white men with like a $3,000 fine and 3 months probation, which is equivalent. Well, I won't go there, but and so there was an outrage. In fact, actually, I'll start with myself personally. I read about the verdict reading. It was Asian Week, a weekly publication based in San Francisco, Chinatown, English publication. And so I'd gone to the Firehouse on Stanford University. That's the Center for the Asian American Student Association. And I saw Francis there, and I told him about this, and I was just outraged. And then I remember Francis says, "Okay, let's have a meeting." And so we joined a town hall meeting at Cameron House, which is a refuge for escaped Chinese women who were trying to escape prostitution during the 1870s. It was run by a white missionary. And so we had this town hall meeting. And after that, hundreds of us marched into San Francisco, Chinatown, chanting in English and in Cantonese, "Justice for Vincent Chin." You have anything to add, Francis?
Well, yeah, I mean, so that gives you some context for why we wanted to record that chant on that to try to document and to express back to the community, the sound of the community, that we heard in that protest. I did want to add, that I think more and more people are finding out about Vincent Chin, but I also that there was, and if you look at the article, can you put up that article again? Anti-Asian Violence, East Wind Magazine. So in there, we in the movement took that opportunity to educate people about the history, of anti-Asian violence, and the fact that actually it was that during that period there was a combination of the anti-Japanese imports, but also the new immigrants coming in from Southeast Asia, and the fact that there was a influx of different Asian immigrants into various communities, because people were kind of dropped in different parts of the country and who just didn't have the history and were really threatened by this. And so I think it kind of came together in terms of anti-immigrant sentiment, which is always comes up in periods of difficult economic times. And so that goes really way back to the 1870s. Anytime there was a recession, there would be a wave of anti-Asian hysteria as part of a way to scapegoat and deflect the causes of the economic hardships.
Yes, and Dennis Kearney, who was a demagogue who founded the Working Men's Party, was trying to fan up that Chinese immigrants were taking jobs away from white workers. So it starts there, and so I'll give another example. In 1989, it was January 1989, a white supremacist entered a elementary school in Stockton, California, and he gunned down, I think it was 4 or maybe 6 Southeast Asian kids. They were like 4 to 6 years old, and then he killed himself. So again, this is just like, Parkland or Sandy Hook. And it's also another anti-Asian violent incident.
Could we look at the slide with Vincent Chin on it?
Yes, that's Vincent Chin.
This horrific murder was a sort of a rallying call, I think, for many Asian Americans. And then it, through processing that grief and anger, that became kind of a source for music. And I was, John, you made Are You Chinese or Charlie Chan? And how did you kind of process some of these emotions and then go about translating it into a composition?
Well, first I'll give an immediate response to this music. This excerpt that you just heard is from the title track, Are You Chinese or Charlie Chan? And if you hear it again, there's 4 hits at the very beginning. That's to symbolize the 4 hits that Vincent Chin was bashed. Now, this section, I call it kind of like the Jimi Hendrix Star Spangled Banner rendition. And you heard Cash Killian, the cellist, play this kind of wild, it's sort of like, to me, a mirror of where we at in white America. And so there is this kind of anxiety, anticipation, trauma, and just, craziness. That's, well, of course, we would talk about with what happened with George Floyd in those 9.5 minutes. And so that's what that is. Now, going to the work, Are You Chinese or Charlie Chan, where does that title come from? In 1981, a year before Vincent Chin was murdered by the 2 white men, there was a film called Charlie Chan and the Curse of the Dragon Lady. And just to give you some history, during the 1930s and 1940s, there were 44 films made about Charlie Chan, who was a fictional detective, but they were played in whiteface by 3 actors. And so this 1981 film about Charlie Chan was going to be the eponymous roles were going to be played by white actors like Peter Ustinov and Angie Dickinson. So there was a protest by the Asian Americans. It was a group called, Coalition to Nix Charlie Chan. That's what it was called. The Coalition to Nix Charlie Chan. And it was a national protest. And that's why I call this piece, Are You Chinese Charlie Chan? Because that was on my mind. And then the second part is, what if the 2 white men beat up and killed Charlie Chan only to discover that he was a white man taking jobs away from Asian American actors? So I kind of flipped the side of that coin. I'm kind of like into black comedy, satire. It's kind of inspired by Charles Mingus' Fables of Faubus. And I think that's why it didn't become a Asian American movement song or anthem, because it was a little bit, well, not a little bit, it was obtuse, I would say. Maybe you can give more of an objective opinion, Francis.
Well, I just think that, just the thing that you always taught me was, I think that, so John, was a much more developed musician. When I met him, I was just starting out, and he encouraged me as an activist to really get serious about my saxophone playing and my music writing. And so one of the things that I learned from Jon that I didn't learn in my violin lessons was about how music could be signifier, and then how that's one of the things that in black music there was a ongoing and very deep practice of signifying, and how in our music we could signify our history, our experiences, our thoughts, our feelings, and and our sense, and also envisioning the future. But also we could use a sarcasm, and all these kinds of things, as a way to make our expression not just about fitting into a commercial bag, but to really make art that would speak to the struggle, and then also that art could be a way that we could organize, because we could people could say, oh yeah, you can make, because people are realizing that you can make music, you can write text, you can write music, you can write your stories, and you can write your truths. And so to me, that's a lot of what was so important about the Are You Chinese or Charlie Chan, was that this really developed view of how we as Asian Americans could express our truth.
You two have both expressed some kind of hesitation about the term political music, or just branding your music as such, and yet your work is also deeply aligned with social justice movements. And so I was wondering if you kind of elaborate about your resistance to the term, and kind of what the distinction is between like so-called political music and then the music that you're attempting to make.
Well, give me an example of what is political music. Or who identifies them as their music as political music, I guess.
Well, there are plenty of contemporary artists who, would say that they're making political music as a kind of immediate response to current events and stuff like that. Or I think maybe because perhaps this label sticks because, just a lot of young people kind of buy into the idea that everything is sort of inherently political. And so you're making a sort of loud statement, and then you brand it political music. But I think your kind of resistance to the term is very interesting and sort of subtle, because you are very political people, but perhaps there's something about the branding of implied by the phrase that you feel uncomfortable with.
Well, I think we would reference, we don't have the slides of this, although we do have slides to Black liberation music books. And let's look at the slide to Black liberation music books. So there were 6 crucial books written about Black music, mostly by Black writers such as Leroy Jones, also known as Amiri Baraka. He wrote Blues People and Black Music. And then there's A.B. Spellman's Black Music, 4 Lives, The Music of Black Americans, Eileen Southern, Black American Music by Hildred Roach. And then there were white writers who wrote about Black music, such as Frank Kofsky, Black Nationalism and the Revolution in Music. And so a number of artists say, such as Max Roach. In fact, let's go to that slide with Max Roach. That's the Freedom Day. Let's go to the Freedom Day slide. Max Roach composed and performed and recorded We Insist, the Freedom Now suite that was inspired by the lunch counter sit-in by 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. The lunch counter sit-in by the 4 Black students galvanized a national movement of sit-ins and protests against racism and segregation. And so Freedom Day is in response to the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, and it questions whether or not Black people will have attained freedom in the fullest sense of the word. this recording featured a collaboration between multiple percussionist Max Roach, vocalist Abby Lincoln, and lyricist Oscar Brown Jr. So this recording was produced 5 years before the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. And let's hear that some of the music of that.
Whisper, listen, whisper, say we're free. Rumors flying, must be lying, can it really be? Can't conceive it, can't believe it, but that's what they say. Slave no longer, this is Freedom Day. Freedom Day, it's Freedom Day. Throw those shackling chains away.
So I don't think Max Roach would identify his music as political music, but I think he would say, I'm a black musician who's taken a political stand. And I think that's how France and I feel. And so let's go to the slide, Reparations Now. So Reparations Now, this is a work that I composed in 1988, and I'll maybe talk about that later, but it was inspired by Charles Mingus' Haitian fight song, and let's hear the music come from that slide. So the Haitian Fight Song by Charles Ming is, to me, is in reference to the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804, the first successful black slave rebellion led by Louis Toussaint. And so I was inspired to compose Reparations Now, Concerto for Large Ensemble, and taiko, which is Japanese drums. And I started writing this in 1987. Reparations Now is sort of pays tribute to the Japanese American movements and their fight for redress and reparations because of what, President Frederick D. Roosevelt, when he issued the EO 9066 on February 19th, 1942, which sent tens of thousands of Japanese Americans, families, and children in U.S. prison camps. So during the 1980s, again, this was during a very difficult time for Japanese Americans to fight because of the anti-import Japanese hysteria. And so anyway, going back to your question, Kat, about political music, yes, I think that my mentors, such as Max Roach and Charles Mingus, I don't think they would identify their music as political music, or I wouldn't identify my music as political music, but actually as an Asian American artist taking a stand through music. I don't know the semantics, but that's just how we feel.
Well, I just like to think about, like, as artists, we play roles in our community. And sometimes we're called upon or we're moved to make political statements in music. But we also are do other kinds of music. We play music at funerals. We play music at weddings. We play music at social events. And so there's a lot of different functions to our work. And even a lot of our work in communities is not even just about performing works, but being present, and being part of making the spaces for the community to love itself, to grieve, to dream. And I think that there's a tendency to talk about political music is to just focus on one kind of function and to paint us in that way in order to limit the interest in our work and also to reduce us to in ways that does not allow us access to be respected in the broader American musical landscape. So that's one of the main reasons why we tend to resist this characterization of our music as political. So I think that's kind of, and then a lot of that comes from just deep engagement in our community, and because people don't know us as just political people, they know we're as folks who help out. Like John used to teach citizenship classes in Chinatown, and I raise money for for example, there's we're gonna listen later, Miyoshi Sketches, which is really about honoring the history, and I don't think that's political necessarily. It's just honoring our heritage, and that's respectful. So sometimes I like to think, well, yeah, our music is respectful of our tradition. So.
Yeah, I think also during the 1980s, political music, or if you're political, if you're part of the left, there's sort of a sense of martyrdom, like you're not having a life. It's important for us to nurture our families I mean, we're not there just because it's the whole, sacrifice and we have to take care of ourselves too. It's really about humanity, in all the different ways. Yeah, I agree with Francis about music's multifunctional.
So
political music is not angry too. There's that kind of stereotype. I don't know if I should say this chant. It's okay. I'll give this one. There was this. I won't mention the leftist group, but they were pretty sectarian, and and this one guy, he just kept saying "f you" all the time, and it just "f you, f you." That seems like he just had a lot of anger, and so. He would use this chant, 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your F war. 5, 6, 7, 8, organize or smash the state. 9, 10, 11, 12, free our sisters, free ourselves. And I would go back and say 13, 14, 15, 16, shut up, Eric, no one's listening. Anyway, that's improvisation. That's why the left left me out. But I was in the left, though. Just out of left field. Well, wait, you're muted. You're the silent Asian. The quiet Asian.
Okay. You're muted now. Okay. But we still can't hear you. Yeah.
You want to try sign language? Can we play music? Okay. We have our later works.
Okay, there we go. Here's something.
Because we're running out of time, can we play the Two Flowers on a Stem?
two lovely pieces of music. I think we're going to switch to the Q&A, but while people are preparing their questions and putting them in the chat, I just might ask one just to kind of get things started. Something that I didn't get to ask earlier was just, how did Asian improv start?
Well, Asian Improv Records really started on. John had made a couple of records for United Front's label, RPM, and by the time he was going to make his a new album, they were no longer operating as a record label, so we had to form our own. And so, and based in kind of our, by the time we were doing this was in 1987, we were, trying to create decided to create an organization that would reflect our Asian American movement values, and to actually create a music organization that would be an arm of the Asian American movement, similar to a lot of organizations like the AACM were extensions of the were part of the Black Arts Movement. So that's how we started, and we started by making that first album called Ballad or the Bullet, and that's where I actually coined Asian American improvised music as kind of a describer of our music. Yeah.
And our mission statement is New Directions in Music by Asian Americans. So we didn't call it Asian American music, and it kind of gave the feeling of it being democratic, that it wasn't questioning what kind of music you're going to contribute, but that it was experimenting, exploring new directions.
For John, about how your music was.
You're breaking up. I wonder if we should get it from the chat. Maybe you can write it in the chat.
So I could ask a question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Great. So I'm really curious how your music has been accepted with various Black audiences. And John, I'm really thinking about when we were at the Museum of Harlem with Dr. Billy Taylor, because that was such an incredible moment. I just wondered if you could share that.
Yes. So in June 1995, I was invited by the Asia Society. And by the way, I do want to thank Rachel Cooper. That's that person right there that spoke earlier, who's the program director of the Asia Society. Rhoda Grauer and Winnie Lee for making it possible for me to, that last piece you heard, Two Flowers on a Stem, that was the outcome of that series called Crossovers, in which we gave performances, we did residency activities such as at the Studio Museum of Harlem. So that was with Dr. Billy Taylor, pianist, composer, icon. And let's see, Jabing Chen, who you heard perform on the erhu, that's a Chinese two-string instrument that you heard on Two Flowers on a Stem, and me. So when I think back, Dr. Billy Taylor had asked Jabing Chen to perform the spiritual Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen. And it was just like a Chinese sorrow song. That's a term that I invented. And it was so beautiful, even though I think Jabing probably didn't have a sense of Black people's history in the United States because she was from China, from Shanghai. But I remember Dr. Billy Taylor said, you don't have to understand the language, you just have to feel. And that's the beauty of music languages. You don't have to understand the languages, but do you have the ability to feel that music? And so at that time, I thought, okay, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. It's like when I was a kid, it was like an old Negro spiritual. That's right how I would look at it. It's a black spiritual. But now when we look at it in the context of George Floyd, the murder and legal lynching of George Floyd, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. When we see that, like, yeah, what his family's going through, his kids, his brothers, his sisters, going through this year, and just what it means to be a black person in this country. It brings a new meaning to nobody knows the trouble I've seen. So I've kind of evolved in my understanding of that. And those spirituals, black spirituals were like songs of survival, and they were codes, just like Wade in the Water was a way to instruct anyway, I'm going off tangent. You asked me to talk about, the experience at Studio Museum of Harlem. So let me just get kind of focused. So there were black people that embraced, I think, Jay Bing and myself. And I remember Pat Cruz, who was, she was the director there. And we talked about Randy Weston's experiments with Afro-Asian, particularly with Min Chao Fen. She's mentioned in his book called African Rhythms, edited by Willard Jenkins. And that was, a book that was published before Randy Weston passed away. I don't. Would you like to reflect on that moment?
Well, I will say that what I remember was somebody standing up and saying, I never thought that somebody Chinese would be able to relate to Paul Robeson in such a strong way. And that guy started crying.
Yes, I remember
always
that.
Stayed with me. He said, I didn't know that you loved our music. I love our music. And I also remember Billy Taylor saying that Chen Bing was like this, right? The music of the spiritual, that it was like, that it had what you were just saying about the grief.
Yeah, I remember, to give you context about the Paul Robeson remark is that, James Newton and I composed a work called When Sorrow Turns to Joy, songlines, a spiritual tributary of Paul Robeson and Mei Lan Fong. But I'll just say that without going into it, that the first Chinese music I heard was a 1978 recording of Paul Robeson singing Chinese folk songs in the context of Japanese imperialism. And it was a 1978 recording called Qi Lai, which is the title of the Chinese national anthem, which is translated as Rise Up. And it was a record that my late father had left behind. And so I didn't know about this until I was a student at Oberlin during the winter break. That when Paul Robeson died in January 1976, there was this PBS special about Paul Robeson. And then my mom started singing Qi Lai. And so I just said, wow, Paul Robeson singing Chinese folk songs. He learned to speak Chinese when he was at the School of Oriental and African Languages in London. And so, this is before the internet, before it's amazing. He learned 8 languages. He could sing and speak fluently in those languages.
We have a question from Kathy Lowry, who says she's thrilled to learn where a reparations song comes from. But she wants to know whether either of you crossed paths with Fred Ho, and how do you view his music and Afro-Asian futurism?
Well, I think it's Afro-Asian futurism. That's the period of 1990s or see, Fred Ho, our relationship was from 1984 to 1990. So maybe we could speak to that, but I don't know. My listening to his music after 1990 is pretty spotty. So I don't know if I could really respond to that. How about you, Francis?
Well, I think we acknowledge the role of Fred's voice and his work in the making of basically, I mean, today is the Asian American future compared to when we started, because, we all worked together 30, 40 years ago. So, I think that in general, Fred has made a big contribution, and, he had different really creative ideas about how to blend popular culture into his expression and works. So, yeah.
So I think Cat is back. So do you have something, a final question, Cat?
Yeah, sorry for the connectivity issues. This is just a classic sort of pandemic problem. But perhaps for, a younger generation of musicians who are kind of trying to find their voice both as, political actors and also just as musicians, do you have any advice to give to them?
Well, I think one of them, piece is just find a space and a crew to pursue some of these issues, right? And because for us, if we were just out in the music industry, we really wouldn't have the space to pursue our own culture and ourselves, because the industry doesn't really provide for that. And so we have to provide that for ourselves. And so there is a tread, independent path in order to get your own voice together. And I just think that that's really, really important before one goes forward, is to really decide what is your purpose, because to me, I really wouldn't have got involved in music as a profession if I didn't see that I had a purpose. And at that time, the purpose was to fight for the equality of and social justice in this country, and through the examples of these masters, and then as well as my peers, my peer group, I found a calling, and I found something that I could give my life to. And so I just feel like that's something that, as young musicians, is like, if you're going to give your life to music, why are you giving your life to it? So that's kind of one of my main pieces of advice.
Well, Jen Shu was a multidisciplinary artist. It was about 20 years ago. She gave this performance. She played on I think, Korean moon guitar. She played piano. She sang. I think she even played the violin as well. She's a real special person. I mean, she was going to, I won't say another Paul Robeson, but another Jen Shu. And she had asked me, do you think I should study jazz standards? And I said, I gave her an emphatic no. I said, jazz singers are a dime a dozen. What you have is something real special. And so I guess she seriously took my perspective or advice, and now she's where she is now. I feel very proud of her. Then there's another artist named Mia Masaoka, and I saw her at a bistro club in Berkeley. She was playing jazz piano for like $25 a night, and she was good, but it's like now she recorded her first recording an Asian improv, which is compositions and improvisations, and she changed instruments to the koto, and she not only learned to perform the koto, but she reinvented the koto, applying music technology, and I think she does some kind of interaction with plants, which I probably don't understand, but she was, I think Jen and Mia developed originals. There's a book called Thelonious Monk, an American original by Robin Kelly. It's one of the best books, not just the best jazz book, but just one of the best books written by Robin Kelly. So I think it's about really finding what we say that the Thelonious Monk said, be yourself. You know, Monk, was it no Monk? Monk no? It's a kind of changing the letters of the name, of his name. Oh, and also one thing that I learned from Yuri Kochiyama is learning your history. And also from my Black mentor, Dr. Wendell Logan at Oberlin, is learning Black music history, learning Black history, learning Asian American history, you know, and, well, Latino histories. And my piano performance students, my piano performance professor at Oberlin said, you're always going to be a student. And so, I can't perform in the same things all the time. I guess that's the Afro or Asian futurism. You just can't stay stuck in the 80s or the 90s or what, you know, we just got to you have to keep moving.
All right. Well, I think on that prophetic note, we're going to keep moving. I just am so grateful to all three of you, because this is a conversation that's so important. And, you know, I know we just touched the tip of the iceberg in many ways, but I think there's so much more to say. And whether it's know your history or keep moving, I think that's totally what we need to do as a society, and I think it's our collective history that we're talking about here. So, Cat, thank you so much. Jon, Francis, it's really been a pleasure. And I hope that our audience will continue to explore the Asia Society. We have many programs, and we have a whole jazz series that will be going on for the next year and a half. And in fact, some of the artists that Jon just mentioned will be a part of it. So thank you all. Please do join us again at the Asia Society. And it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.